I had to decide what was more important,
Mhm.
so-called fortune at the IRS with a secure pension and paycheck, or freedom, for myself, my family, and for our country. But I thought Agent for Truth was a good little moniker there, since I was a special agent with the IRS, and wanted to be the best agent for truth that I could be. So agentfortruth.com is the website. I actually wrote a book, if you don't mind me doing a shameless plug,
No, do it. Yeah.
uh, called Investigating the Federal Income Tax Report to the American People. And that's because in 1999, when I resigned, I wrote a preliminary report. So, of course, now that 23 years have passed, there was a lot more news, including criminally prosecuting me, stripping me of my CPA certificate, all kinds of fun and games that the IRS uh, lash out at. Um, so yeah, I have a podcast. It's actually just through Zoom, kind of a wonkish thing. We have attorneys and paralegals, and we speak. For years, it was about the income tax, of course, and taxation. But over the last couple of years, it's been all about COVID,
Yeah.
because all the lockdowns and the tyranny seem to make the IRS maybe not pale in comparison, but certainly set it off to the side, because it's like the powers that be were fine, through the monetary system and the taxation system, harvesting us like silkworms,
Yep.
and then all of a sudden it changed to we need to kill them. So
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Now we're for dinner, they
yeah.
want us to eat silkworms until we die and they keep us in prison. I agree with you. Absolutely. And I've said many times, Joe, that I think the IRS kind of set a lot of precedents of having a bureaucracy that was a law unto itself. Rand Paul and others have in years past would put out the REINS Act to rein in the bureaucracy, because we now have taxation without representation. We have regulation without representation. Nancy Pelosi said of Obamacare, we got to pass it so we can find out what's in it. They get these funding and they create a bureaucracy, and then they let them create the rules. And then after they create their rules, you don't have any presumption of innocence, you don't have due process, and they have no prohibition against excessive fines, because they say, well, these are rules, these aren't laws. You only have these types of legal protections if it's a law enacted by Congress. So we won't have Congress do any laws. We'll have the bureaucracy create the rules. And so I think that the IRS really took the lead in all of that. But now it's been weaponized by, especially in this medical martial law that we've had. It's been that same tactic now has been extended to all different aspects of our life, hasn't it?
Yes, and in fact, I was as I can talk about, of course, as being criminally prosecuted. So they actually went through the process of indictment, prosecuting me, and I was deservedly acquitted. We could talk about that in a second.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the administrative state, the way that I was stripped of my CPA certificate, that I earned from the state of California back in 1991, was through this administrative state. I basically had a administrative law judge from the Environmental Protection Agency to
Wow.
decide my fate in terms of a disbarment from being able to help clients before the IRS.
How did the EPA? How did they get the EPA involved in that?
I guess he was the only one available, but I think it had a connection with the Department of Homeland Security, because it wasn't a trial, it was more like a hearing, was
Mm-hmm.
supposed to occur on Coast Guard Island in San Francisco Bay.
Hmm.
And that's a military installation where you can only come and go as they allow you. No witnesses. They really, I called it the Shanghai on CGI for Coast Guard Island. So I just to point out that administrative state can really grind you up, and you go through all these appeals, but it's really not due process, not in the true sense.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. They really wiped that out, as we saw during the COVID stuff. You had the CDC claiming that they had control over foreclosures and evictions and things like that. It's just amazing to see how they just pass the power around amongst themselves. And it really is taxation without representation, regulation without representation, and of course, trials really without any representation or legal due process. That's what's really dangerous about this. Tell people a little bit about your process and a little bit about your background, because it's been a while since you've been on, and we got a lot of new listeners who don't know how you went from being a criminal investigation agent for the IRS into somebody that they targeted.
Thank you. Well, so with all the white hair, it's been quite a while, but after graduating from college and recognizing that the accounting profession was quite boring, it took me a while to figure that out. I don't know why, but I also had lots of friends and relatives in law enforcement, and so I thought, well, how can I match this accounting degree and experience with law enforcement? And so, of course, an investigative role came about. So I applied to the FBI and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and the FBI actually had a hiring freeze. I qualified to be sent to Quantico, Virginia, but due to a hiring freeze, I was basically in this holding pattern. Then the IRS called, and granted, the FBI has gotten a worse and worse reputation as the decades roll along, but back then in the 90s, at least to carve away a Ruby Ridge, and as I say, it was an unfolding process. But compared to the IRS, I thought, well, the FBI would definitely be a better agency. But there was a hiring freeze. So the idea of working for the IRS kind of grew on me because it was a special agent position, a criminal investigator, gun and a badge. You're working on money laundering cases, really detailed, cases with other agencies. And, I'm granted tax and accounting was my background, so it seemed like a pretty good fit. So in November 93, I was sworn in as an IRS special agent. And just for the audience, the IRS has a civil functions where there's audits and levies and things like that. And then they have a criminal investigation function where when proof of an intentional violation of a law can be investigated, then you'd have a criminal investigator who would do that, much like a police officer would investigate a crime scene, or whether it be Secret Service investigating counterfeiting or.
I am the CFO co-owner at Advantage Archives.
We're talking with Chris Donahue about Midwest One Bank.
Midwest One Bank helped us finance the purchase of the business, and they also do our day-to-day financing through their operating line of credit. Midwest One Bank came in and really took the time to learn our business and come up with a financing plan that worked for us. It's working great. We're looking at a great future with Midwest One Bank.
Midwest One Bank. Simply better banking. Member FDIC, Equal Housing Lender. We're talking with Randy Smith from Lifeline Emergency Vehicles about Midwest One Bank.
Midwest One Bank has always been there to support us along the way. Lifeline has needed to expand, whether it be with equipment or facilities. There's territories that we don't exist in today that in order for us to be able to serve those territories, we need more capacity. We talk to our partners at Midwest One Bank. They're always there when we need them.
Midwest One Bank. Simply better banking. Member FDIC, Equal Housing Lender.
Whatever it might be. So the IRS
does it have to be something associated with a crime, or is it something that is tax evasion as opposed to
avoidance?
Avoidance, yeah. Avoidance is, I can't remember which is like the approval versus the authorization for the vaccines. So it's okay, and it's part of the game to try to avoid your taxes, and that's encouraged. But if you evade your taxes, then is that when they get the criminal people involved, or do they still have, for evasion, do they still have some of the non-criminal auditors involved with that?
Well, that's the way it's supposed to work. In other words, if you don't have a mens rea, you don't have a criminal intent, then it should be in the purview of avoidance, which even the Supreme Court, numerous courts have ruled tax avoidance is not a crime. In fact, it's expected. Mm-hmm. But the way another mission creep for the IRS is even tax avoidance has become a punishable matter. Really? So, it's something for people to keep in mind. But anyway, the difference between the two is that tax avoidance is, utilizing the law as written to minimize or eliminate taxes as much as possible. Tax evasion is knowing that you have a known legal duty to obey some law or provide such information, and then purposely not doing so. Willfully is actually the word that they use.
So when we look at this explosion in the IRS, and let's continue on with your story. I don't want to get away with your story. Let's go back and talk about your journey. You go to work for the IRS, and then what happens?
So in 1993, and I expected to spend a full 20-year career there because as a law enforcement position, it's not a 30-year retirement, it's a 20-year retirement. You work 50-hour work weeks, so you're getting basically a 25% premium in your pay, plus the extra pay for being a law enforcement kind of person, gun and badge and all that. So I really expected to spend a 20-year career there, and again, because you're investigating money laundering and really intricate crimes, and protecting the Treasury as you're thinking you're doing that, and so I believe those functions are necessary. And so my expectations were kind of changed when about 3 years into my career there, I was listening to a talk radio show, and that's why I'm so people like David Knight are so admirable. Because you got the truth pills dispensing in big bottles. But anyway, I was an avid talk radio listener, and so they had a guest on the show talking about the income tax and the Federal Reserve, and all the things that back in the 90s and prior to that were just thought of as the kookiest subject matter, right?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, we'd run people for office with the Libertarian Party, and we'd start out by saying we want to abolish the income tax and the IRS. And everybody, they're just radical. You don't even listen to these people, right? So yeah, I know.
Yes. Yeah. The pioneers. So thank goodness for the pioneers, the trailblazers. So anyway, listened, and then it was on a talk show of a guy that was always telling the truth about every other thing. So I thought, well, why would he lie to us now? Why would he have a guest on that would lie to his audience? So that's what got me started. So I spent 2 years off duty, evenings and weekends investigating whether or not these claims about the income tax were actually true. And the basic claim was that the IRS, the income tax, was not actually required to be paid by most Americans because no federal law ever made them liable to pay the tax. And the IRS's own instructions, their own regulations state that if you're liable for a tax, then you have all these requirements that you have to follow. But it's that key juncture, are you liable? And nowadays, any American can search the internet and search through the entire thick Internal Revenue Code. Old guys like us would call it thick, right? It's just on a computer screen now. But you can search through all these laws and find out, well, where do I become liable? How does this happen? The IRS says I have to do all these things if I'm liable for the tax. Let's see where that happens. And then Americans who do the research come to find out that, oh, wow, I'm not liable for the income tax. Is that some kind of an oversight?
I remember for years they would send out the package. I don't know if they do this anymore, but they would say, the income tax is a voluntary thing, and we really do appreciate you volunteering. And I used to think that was the most cynical thing, but it's just like you would get the printed paper maps, and it would always have something there from the governor of whatever the state was, reminding you that driving is a privilege. Well, the IRS would always send this thing out and say, and thank you for complying with this voluntarily. And all the rest, I was like, what are they talking about? I know what's going to happen if I don't volunteer. They're going to voluntarily haul me away.
No, that's exactly, and that's kind of like when they say if you're blindfolded and there's an elephant in the room, but you don't know it, and you touch, and there's a trunk, and you touch, and there's a big toenail, and so those kinds of clues, even from the commissioners who would write those introductory letters each year, that's just one of many parts of the elephant to indicate how illegitimate the IRS's enforcement and administration of the income tax actually is. And of course, I always hesitate. I'm not like urging people like the Pied Piper, go out and battle with the IRS.
That's the problem. Even if they don't have authority, they got a lot of power. And we see power abused all the time without authority. I mean, look at the last couple of years here, how they've abused without authority, they've abused their power. It's absolutely amazing. And you're talking about how thick it's become. And that's one of the ways that they can really control you. If the law is sufficiently complex so that nobody knows what it is, really, that's the same as having no law at all. And that really has been kind of the operating principle of much of the government.